So I say we begin, and certainly others will trickle in as I begin the intro, and that's all right. So welcome, everyone. So if I've not connected with you before, my name is Kelly Kobe. I'm a scientist at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute, where I direct a meta research and open science program. And I'm also one of the co-leads of the Canadian Reproducibility Network. So the Canadian Reproducibility Network thinks of reproducibility very broadly. And one of the initiatives that we have, or sort of pillars of focus right now, is around responsible research assessment. And in that respect, we are doing a 4-part speaker series, of which today we're lucky to have Dr. Catherine Graham speaking. Before we kick off, I just want to sort of acknowledge that I'm calling in from Ottawa, the unceded land of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, and would invite folks joining from Canada or elsewhere where land acknowledgements are relevant to do so in the chat. We're not going to waste any time because I think Catherine's got a really great talk planned for us today. She's going to go through her presentation. If you have questions as you're seeing her presentation, please feel free to put them in the Q&A and we'll address them in the discussion afterwards. And certainly afterwards, feel free to raise your hand and unmute and interact directly. Really looking forward to the talk. So if you've not met Dr. Graham before, she's a professor of research impact assessment, and she runs the Research Impact Assessment Lab at the University of Calgary. So real pleasure to have you here today and looking forward to your talk.
Thanks very much, Kelly. And Kelly has been very kind to me today in driving my slides. So next slide, Kelly. I'll just go next. And I'd just like to acknowledge I'm seated in the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 6 region here and Métis nations in Alberta. So welcome, everyone. Next. So I really like the title of this presentation, and about impact assessment and how do we get it right. So that will be really the focus of the presentation. I'm going to go through the journey of how we get it right, what we know, and really open it up for discussion and next steps. I see a lot of my colleagues here today, so very excited to see them. And if anyone knows me, very informal, really wanting to kind of have an engaged conversation in this area, and particularly as it's pertinent to research reproducibility. Next. So just very high level, the lab is very much focused on working together in assessing research and innovation impact, but also working very closely on how we activate it or how we mobilize it. So work very closely with the premise of together we can mobilize to action. And one of my learnings in research impact assessment, if you actually want to get to impact, you have to have trust. Trust from many of the communities we work with in terms of value and values, impact, and getting to action. Next. And again, some of my colleagues are here, just when I started out, I've been doing assessing performance and impact for 30 years, but research and innovation impact for over 17 years, and started out in Alberta Innovates, the provincial research and innovation funding agency, and really that's me on the left. I felt very alone in Canada and kind of wanted to know, was anyone else tasked with what I was tasked with? and really reached out to the community in Canada and internationally to really understand what was happening. And again, I know with some colleagues here, there wasn't a lot of conversation 17 years ago around research impact and assessment. Compared to today, and in this webinar, I do think we're in the Renaissance period, and I do think that reflects kind of the professionalism, but the interest and synergies of research impact assessment with a lot of initiatives that are happening, across the world. So I'm saying we're in the Renaissance, so a nice, lively, energetic place to be. Next. But first, some key concepts. Next. So, so what is impact? There are many definitions. This one from the OECD is really looking or presenting impact in terms of those longer term changes and effects. And when we talk about those impacts, often the dimensions we're talking about are health, social, economic, environment, cultural, etc. But what is very important when we're assessing impact, if we want to activate impact, is really focusing on not only what is the impact, but who is benefiting. So that will be kind of a common thread through this presentation. And also another kind of thread is often we think and talk about impact long term, but what are those more proximal or more upstream impacts when we're thinking about research moving along a pathway? Next. So at a policy level across the world, and this is why I think there's this kind of renaissance, there's lots of drivers and benefits for impact. So there's making the case for public funding, which is very much, in terms of accountability, transparency, which we see a lot of, but also research institutions are wanting to focus on their kind of social contract with the community, third mission or service. We also, funders have a lot of interest in having evidence for impact to inform policy. So we're quite interested in how what we're doing can be enhanced for greater impact. And then a big driver when we're particularly talking about societal impact is the synergy between science and society and making it relevant and connected to our interest holders. Next. So now we're going to go on our impact journey together. Next. So when Kelly invited me to do this presentation about getting research impact assessment right, I thought it was a great title, but it made me reflect on what do we know is right? And so I thought the way to approach this webinar was to talk about a process to getting it right, because what do we know? We know the known knowns, so we'll be talking about that. We have known unknowns, and of course there's the unknowns, so we just don't know. So again, acknowledging maybe blind spots just because we don't know them. So I just saw that comment about the audio. Okay, thanks. So hopefully it's okay with for most people. Yeah, great. And then the other is I'm going to walk through this process of how we can assess impact, because we want to be able to fit for purpose our assessment to the purpose of the assessment and to providing evidence to interest holders. So that's kind of Kelly's opening remarks. Is there, because of this renaissance, there's a lot happening around the world with synergies together, and sometimes it may be confusing. So I thought today we could start with a kind of walk through a process and some consensus that we have wherever we sit in the ecosystem, to discuss that. And also, of course, there's quite a lot of lively debates. And why I'm starting more from a consensus point of view, I wanted to share a story with you when I started off very early in assessing impact. At the time, I was the program co-chair of the Research Technology Development Group out of the American Aval Association. And it was with the Obama administration at the time, and with the Office of the Management Budget, and essentially the department that allocates all the funding in the US, was interested in knowing how to assess the outcomes and impact of public investments. So they did an environmental scan at the time in the US and went to experts and came to the American Aval Association to say, well, what is the consensus on impact as research impact assessment? And true to scientists and professionals, we all led with, oh, here are all the challenges with impact and assessment and time lags and counterfactuals. Because we didn't want to overpromise. And after their assessment, they kind of came back to us and said, well, there is no consensus on how to assess research impact assessment. Of course, we were horrified because everyone was doing their due diligence. And then we came and we wrote a white paper on what was the consensus. And particularly at the time in the US, there was a lot of work going on in meta science, policy and policy science. So my lesson learned was really to talk about where there is consensus and then move into the challenges. Next slide. So I'm going to go through this six-stage process. It aligns very much to a lot of processes for responsible assessment, for how you assess impact, and it's an evolution from a publication that we did for the International School on Research Impact Assessment, which had 10 guidelines in terms of the process for how you would responsibly assess impact. And there's, again, a lot of consensus in the community on that process. Next slide. So as we go through this process, coming at it very much from an impact assessment, again, we always start and we lead with what is the desired impact and who benefits. And in working with researchers, researchers typically lead with their research, which makes total sense. But when we work together on assessing impact and enhancing it, we lead with the impact and who benefits. So thinking about research reproducibility and a network, again, we would lead with that. Next slide. So In terms of research impact assessment at a policy level and across nations, there are different impact and assessment frameworks. In Canada, one example is the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences, and I know my colleague David Phipps is on the call, and the other very prominent model in Canada is the co-produce pathways, which is really important for emphasizing how you get research into practice, because you need collaborators and partners to get there. So very influential in terms of the process to get to impact, but the assessing the impact. Most operationalized framework in the world is when it comes to impact as a component, research excellence frameworks. So I just wanted to say, when we're looking at it from context, understanding the frameworks and the culture in our countries to how to assess impact matters, because it will influence us in terms of our choices. And I just given that we're talking about reproducible research, I was just wondering in the chat if there are frameworks very much focused on the reproducible research. So just opening it up for people to put in the chat there about any frameworks that are being used or references or yeah. And just doing my homework and interested actually in research reproducibility. I have seen work from UNESCO, their FORT model and framework, and the kind of looking at how to build that capacity and capability. Next slide. So just giving an example of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences framework as an example of how essentially the framework leads with impact. Okay, so that if you invest in research, you should expect knowledge to be advanced, building a capacity to be built, informing decision making. And what is good about CAS is the who again, in who you need to inform to get it to actual impact. So that is just an example of an impact assessment framework, but it is an advantage when you want to communicate and frame your impact to use some common language and tools. And what I'm seeing in the chat as part of this framing is that these frameworks can help with that kind of narrative and communication. So the open science frameworks as being very relevant. And just in green throughout the slides, those statements are just some statements, consensus from the community, not saying there's not lively debates, but again, what is the synergies between us all? Next slide. So as we're going through this process, is who matters. So if we're trying to get research and move it across pathways, the process to getting to impact to assess it is important. And here in Canada, I think there's a depth of expertise around the practice and the science and with knowledge mobilization, the co-produced pathways as a really nice complement of the process to getting to impact. And then what are the impacts of interest and assessing and keeping us focused on who benefits. So I do think, you know, a very powerful mix. Next slide. So when we're talking about impact, assessment is different than research, even though we use research methods, because our purpose for assessing impact is to collect evidence to answer decision makers' questions, their assessment questions. So this is a nice heuristic, maybe, I don't know if that's the right word, for understanding the motivations and the purposes for impact. It's originally started with 4 A's, so assessing impact for allocation, accountability, advocacy, and analysis. And in Canada, particularly, I keep adding and learning to that, because I don't think the analysis reflects kind of that learning and feedback loop, but I know it ruins the alliteration. And more recently, acclaim and adaptation got added. And the alignment there is outside of that, because in the work that I do in terms of impact assessment and management, aligning at a policy level and across those ecosystems is very important. So we added another A. So just a nice, useful tool. And Eddie is saying the alliteration is Jonathan Grant's fault, and he is correct. He loves alliteration. I love alliteration because I can never remember anything, so it helps me remember. And then totally right, adding the learning just upsets it. But I think an important conversation, though, for us, if we're trying to enhance not only the assessment of impact, but actually achieving it. So here is just an example of different dimensions of impact. On the left, this is from the University College Galway, where the university said these are the dimensions of impact we're interested in, and they've identified academic from societal and economic and the breakdown. So when we're engaging, it's very important when we're assessing impact to understand the impacts of interest from our interest holders. And then once we kind of understand that, then we want to understand what questions they have, because we are trying to evidence to answer that. Next, please. So now we're kind of talking about pathways to getting to impact. This is a logic model and quite a dominant paradigm in the world, and with funders, and it really looks at the it's a framework. Sometimes we use it as a pathway. So how do we get from inputs, activities, outputs, etc.? Because sometimes some people do not want to use an existing framework. So this is kind of a general pathway that can be modified. And yeah, and I'm seeing really cool stuff in the chat. On top of that, we usually would have a theory of change. I just put in a theory of change for reproducible research, but you know, the theory is this reuse. So when we go to assess it, keeping that in mind matters. Okay, next. So just going back to CAS as an example of pathways, what's interesting about CAS, which often does not get highlighted, they actually had a matrix of what is the impact on the left, and then on the right, on top of that is essentially, it's the payback model, but really it's kind of that logic model. And then for David Phipps here, who has a co-produced pathway, the
Yes.
process.
You're very welcome.
Okay, sorry, I just hear somebody there. Is really, very similar to the co-produced pathway there, which really illustrates this nice idea of the process with the impact. Again, I think a contribution Canada can make. And this is only an example if you were trying to trace the pathways on commercializing a drug. Next. So the other useful thing when it comes to measuring impact, pending your framework, then you have indicators that you can use or pick pending your purpose. This is only example. This framework has 66 indicators as a pick list that you can refer to. Next, please. So again, so I started to get interested in kind of research reproducibility. This is only a mock-up of kind of doing a logic model and, understanding kind of work that's been done in the community on logic models in this area, I think would be very interesting, and also how people are assessing the impact. But I want to draw you to the last column, particularly when you're trying to assess impact, understanding what that desired impact is. And this is only a mock-up for this webinar, but here are 3 proposed impacts from reproducible research: is the scientific progress, the public trust, which I hadn't thought about, but of course makes total sense, and the innovation. So as I said, we would start at looking at the desired impacts and then go back to the inputs versus thinking of the research producibility impacts. And then what are those mechanisms and partnerships and collaborations that we need to do to enable research to be reproduced? So not only from the researcher's point of view, but as I'm seeing in the chat, you need policies on open science, open innovation, sharing. So when we're thinking about how we get to impact and assess it, we're looking at different levels, not only the researcher level, but policymakers, funders, or funders funding this type of work to reproduce it to get to this impact. And I'm seeing phenomenal resources and references here. So it'd be really nice to curate this as part of the network. So just thank you very much for all the sharing here. And yeah, and I'm looking at and just to pick up on David's point is, and again, if we put it in from a research reproducibility, we think of it over time. And I do have a slide that talks to the approach depending on the time. So assess and continuous monitoring. So how do we know we've made a difference? Next. So we look to guidance in, again, we're in this renaissance. So we have lots of guidance. Here are some examples that are quite, I think, relevant to this conversation. but is happening and moving around the world. Again, I'm just going to ask you in the chat. Of course, I haven't identified all of them, but if there are other kind of movements or statements, guidelines, etc., that are very relevant or pertinent or interesting, just put it in the chat. But what's important, if we go back to my story, if we're talking to wider audiences, is to give them a sense of consensus or cohesion. And then we're all taking little slices of it. But what we're seeing a movement on, and Research Impact Canada's, you know, they have loads of resources and discussions and journal reviews. But what we're seeing in our community is conversations about taking a more holistic view in research impact assessment, not having narrow measures or simple measures, and being more holistic with the perspectives and values. So a lot of synergy that we are guided by this, and reform movements like COARA, like very influential. And I wish all of this was here 17 years ago. So just phenomenal to have these dialogues. Next slide. I just wanted, as an example, again, to show you work out of the Research and Research Institute internationally. At a policy level, they have a project underway, Agora, and an atlas on looking at the typologies across 13 countries that have these formal national assessment, research and excellence frameworks that include assessment. Canada's not included because we don't have one, okay, like the other national systems. And they're doing this typology. But for me, as a community, if we're talking about assessment, you're starting to see quite a lot of convergence, you know, the purpose, the scope, the focus. And so that's very helpful for us, as this evidence also confirms the movement from the conversations we're having in the community. Next. Typically, there is consensus that mixed methods, multiple data sources are very relevant when assessing impact. Again, we have different worldviews on this, though, in the science and how to assess it. So acknowledging our worldviews. So I'm a social scientist, or social science humanities. So I'll come at it with my worldviews and my biases. So kind of declaring it, understanding it, will help us move forward. Next slide. Again, just very practically, if we're assessing impact, and really often an Achilles heel for all of us is, what are the data sources, but what are those practical reporting tools if we're trying to get to impact? And particularly with research reproducibility, important for impact assessment is, if we're looking at assessing something, is really to look in the landscape to see what are all the assessments that have been done to date, evaluated, and if there was even any synthesis of all of those. So the same kind of thinking applies when assessing impact. And again, this caution, again, lots of guidance on this. Metrics alone, or simple metrics alone, are insufficient and not taking a wider approach. Next, please. So I just wanted to highlight how impact generally is assessed in research. So for simplicity, impact is really looking at the research excellence and the societal impact. And the criteria used is there's many, but I'm just consensus-wise is the importance of significance and reach. And there are different definitions of this, but again, I just want to highlight is what and who. And again, in Canada, I think we've done a very good job on the who, but that reach is very important if we want to move across pathways, co-produce pathways. I'm calling pathways now relational pathways because of my learnings on how important the who is in terms of the what. Next slide. So how do we know that the difference we've made is due to us, which keeps us awake at night? And I saw in the chat is attribution, contribution. So when it comes to impact, a big discussion in impact assessment is how we establish the counterfactual. The counterfactual is without us. So in other words, if we have a reproducible research or a reproducible research network, is what work we're doing, what has it made a difference, and how do we demonstrate our cause? But when it comes to impact, the challenge is time, and as we have less control over cause effect, and as we move out, we talk about the influence and then those impacts, and we change our language to contribution, just so you know, because sometimes it can be very challenging to say we caused it from a practice-based point of view. And picking up on David, if you think of time and also where you're situated, so if you have a research initiative at the beginning, we talk about the plan or ex ante. So our proposition is if we plan for impact and involve the who as part of co-design earlier on, we're more likely to get to impact. And then it really is the prediction or the potential at the beginning, and then during the initiative, we tend to monitor, are we making an impact? And those progress indicators help us there. And then typically impact assessment is assessed at the end, so did we achieve it? And kind of part of my reflections and thinking in this space is, a lot of the impact assessments are done ex post because they're part of a national assessment system, and you can't allocate money or accountability only on what's achieved, not on potential. But when it comes to assessment, and realizing or optimizing impact, the optimization is in the beginning. It's at that co-design planning and during, because you can adjust and adapt. Again, a proposition I think Canada can really contribute in that optimization. Next slide. And then when it comes to the attribution, this is a resource put out by Impact Canada, again, looking at it in terms of the rigor of attribution to causing that impact. But as I said, we look at it from contribution and attribution, but this design is designed for measuring and attributing. Next slide. We're getting there, guys. So normally I start the presentations with this slide, okay? These are all the challenges with assessing and measuring impact. We've got the time lags, we got, the attribution issue versus contribution, we got the costs of, how do you assess it and put it in. You've got what unit of assessment are we talking about? Is it at the level of the ecosystem and organization? The data is a big challenge, the big data of actually having quality data, and that's not too costly, if you're using some of the secondary data and the primary data collection that's needed. So again, on reflection from my own lessons learned and the synergies, starting with what there is consensus on, but of course, highlighting these challenges. Next slide. Establishing the counterfactual. So we're reaching the summit, and a lot of this process is very much, engaging, understanding the purpose, understanding the questions, collecting the data, mixed methods, and then communicating that so that the research is used and has impact. And a lot of work has been done. Research Impact Canada, we're doing work as well on how, Eddie, I know, has done work in this, in how do we narrate these stories with the evidence so it can reach a wider audience. So lots of work being done on Canada in this co-impact narrative. It is kind of based on the research excellence framework. They have a 4 or 5 page template that's been used. We're learning from them with their rigor and how they've been using it as part of an assessment. So the UK asks universities to submit a number of research impact assessment case studies, these 4 or 5 templates about how they got to impact and their impact and how they achieved it. I don't call them case studies, I call them narratives because it's confusing between research case studies. But because we don't have a research excellence framework and accountability ex post, we can use it actually for learning at the beginning and enhancing it and communicating this kind of co-produced pathways to how we get to impact. And the other change in this is we're not looking at it simply as a researcher impact anymore, because a researcher cannot alone, kind of relies impact. In a lot of times they need, collaborations and the partnerships to help. So it's changing us how we are getting to impact because of the research. Next slide. And this is a shameless plug in kind of impact management. In Canada, we don't really talk a lot about impact management. This is a definition, I think, from OECD, but it's really important if we're trying to activate impact within our institutions in enabling researchers to implement, to have data collection systems, reporting systems, capacity building, to have that infrastructure so that impact can be scaled within and across institutions. So just wanted to acknowledge that language that we tend not to use in Canada, used more in Europe. Next slide. And so, this is kind of my proposition on reflection in really being involved in research impact assessment for a long time, and this focus on this ex post when it's done, and bringing in the learnings from my colleagues on the call is, why don't we rethink this? in terms of co-designing at the beginning is our potential for impact, the co-produced or relational pathways to help mobilizing. And then very new is this co-management with our partners and collaborators, but the infrastructure that's needed, and this synergy between science and society, science with the internal validity of rigor, but the society wanting relevance and the external validity. Let's be synergistic. Next slide. So sorry for going so long, but again, I really wanted kind of, you know, your views on this. We live in different places in the ecosystem, and kind of, you know, let's discuss. So Kelly, I don't know what's the best way, in the chat or put your hands up, you know.
Yeah, for sure. So I'll maybe just stop sharing my slides so I can see the screen better myself, if that's all right. Super great talk, Catherine. And the slides themselves are also super compelling. If you're willing to share them, I'm sure they'd be a great resource for many. Why don't I sort of pause and just sort of let others reflect on the talk. Feel free to raise your hands and share a comment or thoughts and begin the discussion. While people are being shy, I'll start, but please. Oh, we've got David. Yeah. Go ahead, David.
Great, thanks very much for this. My question is, but I kind of like what Gail put in last, where do learning health systems fit? So maybe that's a quick question, Catherine. But one thing I've never seen you do before is co-manage. So could you maybe make a comment for Gail, where do learning health systems fit, and then maybe dig a little bit into co-manage, because that's really new. I've not heard about that.
Yeah, so I think the philosophy and principles of a learning health system is there in that, you know, that co-model. And I know there's lots of knowledge mobilization experts here, and they're going, oh, for God's sake, what is a co-model? And the reason I call it a co-model is because often we talk about collaboration, but I don't think it cuts it, because if we think of co in our head, we sometimes go collaboration, convening, connecting, committing, and I didn't want to say all of those C's. So kind of what co means to you is kind of what I was trying to kind of get at and reflect on it. But in that model, I have double arrows in yellow, and that's really the kind of part of the learning health system. As we're going through these stages, we're learning and adapting. Again, different language, but in the impact assessment language, it's called adaptive impact management. It's a whole other language, but you know, we've got to see our synergies on our language, but it is very much that learning health system. And part of my argument or proposition on my own weaknesses is not really assessing and considering those different stages across impact, because we're dipping into different tools and processes as we move along. So huge synergy with the learning health system philosophy. And then David, where the co-management came from, I'm working on a research project with Indigenous-led pathways, and I assess not only health, environment, etc., but in the environmental impact assessment, there's in their structure, different than in research and innovation impact assessment, in engaging with different communities, is not a management. So that title of that book should I would change it now, is co-management through the process. So again, a reflection on picking up on the co-produced pathways. How do we co-manage this together? So yes, David, a new concept. Yeah.
Thank you both. Quintin, over to you.
Hello there, my name's Quintin Kreth, and I'm a postdoc at York University working with Kane Birch on a project on science assessment in Canada. And one thing that I think is important here that's related to our project that is the idea of what is being measured and how things are being quantified, what the data sources are that different things are using in some of the more standardized systems, RIF and whatnot. You see that there's gonna be pretty common sources of data that are used to determine impact, but you can have variation between different databases on research impact and what things are specifically being looked at in a diffuse system like Canada. And I think that that's important to think about what the sources of data are that are being used. And if anyone has any more comments on that or things they want to point out, feel free to reach out to me.
Yeah, and again, I think when it comes to implementation, Quintin, this is our Achilles heel in a way, because if you think of CAS, the advancing knowledge is mostly, it can be mostly bibliometrics, but when we're moving out wider, what are those? There's different data sources. CAS kind of does highlight some of them, Stats Canada, etc. But again, that is something practically we need to work on identifying those data sources and ensuring quality, etc. I'm also interested in that, and being at the U of C, happy to take it offline. I've gone to the data scientists and go, well, given our secondary data, is there any way that we can use what exists to reduce the admin burden? And is there a kind of innovative approaches and tools, OpenAlex, OpenAI, that we can start rethinking the data sources to reduce admin burden? So.
Over to you, Eddie.
I'm glad I put my hand up because it actually connects both of those points. Learning health systems is a really interesting one because it is a new source of data. Like, this is a great thing for research impact, is that when we developed CAS, one of the things we didn't have was any insight into where there was data on shifts in health systems. Yeah. And so learning health systems is actually a really interesting one because it's not just the idea that it is a changing system of impact-driven approaches to the learning health system. It's also a way to get data into understanding the impact of research within healthcare, within health systems. And so I think there's a really interesting combo on that. I do think there are when we think about data, there's some challenges around what quality of data is. And Catherine and I have argued for years that Canada would have been really nice to have had a version of Research Fish where we were connecting data to research activity in some way. But I think there's lots of interesting areas where we could pull data. The challenge is always, how do you connect that to the research component? Like, with data impact isn't really that much of a problem. Connecting data impact to the thing that you did in the research world, that's the problem.
Yeah, and I also think for impact is the longitudinal aspect, this kind of tracing, because we have hypotheses, so being able to evidence it. And also we want to go post-grant, because the time needed to realize the impact is needed. So and reproducibility is important as part of that journey in terms of use, but the reuse. So yeah. If we're really trying to tell a holistic story of demonstrating and communicating research in Canada, we do need that relational, longitudinal, linked data to evidence those relational pathways. Yes. if anyone if anyone has the answer or can direct us or to getting funding in moving this, like, it's really a research question. Yeah, it's very cool. It's very cool, Eddie. Yeah, and then, the work being moved in the learning health system is really spot on with this. Yeah.
Thank you all. Any other questions or comments for Catherine that folks want to make? No. Well, we're coming close to time anyway. Catherine, any final remarks from you before I close us out with a couple of housekeeping notes?
Yeah, I'll just end on the WHO again and the CO. So really having the opportunity to be here today was phenomenal, and understanding kind of research reproducibility and how it fit with impact assessment was very insightful for me. So there's lots of networks and communities here. We use different language, we use different tools, but when we sit down together, we influence each other in a very positive way. I'll say to David Phipps has really influenced me on the WHO, and because I'm so focused on the what, because I wanted the data. So I think, coming together with the synergies of where slices are together as part of those pathways. Also, I don't think it will take long in Canada's community and even internationally to curate a kind of the resources, the tools, and the awareness of the richness that is going on there. So I'm going to end on a very positive note.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Catherine. I think really a fabulous talk, very clear from our discussion, lots of engagement from folks too. Just to sort of close us out, obviously a big thank you to Catherine. My colleague Mamoon will again follow up like after last session with a summary of the session with the slides and the video so that folks can share those or go through them again. The next session is November 19th at 12 Eastern Standard Time. And we have Gabriel Pelletier from the Neuro speaking about how to implement open science criteria as part of research assessment. So he's a fantastic speaker as well. So hope to see you at that session. And then I just want to highlight the session after that is sort of a coming together of everyone in terms of what we want for this community of practice. So I have just been making up topics and inviting friends and peers to give some content and outreach, but I'm really hoping to hear a little bit more from the community about sort of what would be helpful going into 2026 and what the format might look like. There is a possibility, for instance, of doing a sort of in-person event. So looking at sort of how we might operationalize that and getting feedback would be really, really beneficial. In the meantime, a big thank you all for your time and attention. I think it's really great to be part of this community and so many diverse sort of perspectives. I, for one, can say that research impact was not at all part of my sort of journey into the responsible research assessment space. So it's an area I'm still learning a lot about and excited to see the breadth of and depth of resources and expertise we're having in Canada. So thanks again, and we'll be in touch hopefully soon. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.